Hi everyone, today we're going to learn how to use Excel to do the t-test type of hypothesis tests. There's two different types of t-tests. Doing them is very easy in Excel, but I'll give you a demo of how that looks and so that you can make your way easily through our worksheet this week. Let me share my screen. All right, our first tab, notice there's two questions on the worksheet this week. There's question 1 and there's question 2. So those data are on different tabs for you. So focusing on question 1, it has 2 parts. So the same data are included, but they're sorted in 2 different ways. So we're going to ask 2 questions. Is there a difference between roly-polies? So these data are actual real data that students on campus collected about our friendly roly-poly animals. And we collected them around building 30. And we also collected them around, we're going to scroll down so we can see the other group, around 42 Ws, the small gym. And we measured their length. Right, and we also identified them, whether they're males or females. So you just have to put them on their back and look at their lower abdomen. And you can see the males have a reproductive structure that is visible using a dissecting microscope. So we can sex the roly-polies. All right, so we have the same length data. And it's just sorted in these 2 pairs of columns. So we have the site and the length over here kind of on the left. We have an indicator that tells us what site the individual's from. And then over here on the right, we have same data, but each individual is identified by its sex, female or male, rather than by its location. So later on in the semester, we'll learn a more sophisticated analysis we could maybe do on both of these pieces of information at the same time, but we're going to do these separately. So we can ask the question, is there a difference in size of roly-polies between these 2 sites? And we could also ask the question, is there a difference in size between male and female roly-polies? All right, so for a t-test, there are 2 things that are important in determining if the assumptions for the test are met. One of them is the sample size. Bigger sample sizes are better. And we're going to be doing 2 independent samples t-tests, but we also need to make a histogram of the data to see if it's normally distributed. So I know we've been working on histograms already in class. We've done quite a few of them. They're a little bit challenging to do, so I will do one more histogram for you to practice going through all the steps to make your perfect histogram. So remember, you have to have the data analysis tool pack in order to do that. And in order to find that, you're going to go to the data tab at the top, and then here's my tool pack. One moment. Sorry, I had to reinstall my data analysis tool pack. Sometimes it just disappeared. It claimed I had it. I just uninstalled it and reinstalled it. Sometimes that happens. All right. Data analysis tool pack, histogram, okay. Now my assumption under the null hypothesis is that all my roly-polies come from the same population. And so if I make a histogram under the null hypothesis, I will put all of my individuals together, not trying to separate them out by what group they're in. So my input range is going to be all of my data. The data for both of these research questions is the same. So you only need to make one histogram for both of these questions. So I'm highlighting all my data, not the text identifiers. My bin range, I'm going to leave empty because Excel is going to do a pretty good job on this histogram. I have to specify an output range where my stuff is going to go on my spreadsheet. I've got plenty of room to do it here. And don't forget to click chart output so that Excel makes a histogram for you. All right, that was just telling me that the chart was going to cover some of the data. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to delete it, just cover it. Okay, so I've got a couple things to fix on my histogram. Wow, that is not super normally distributed. For deleted frequency, I'm going to change the color. Remember, you want to go to the chart design, sorry, the chart format tab to see all of these options. You don't see the one you want, you can use the right click to get the format menu on the right hand side. I'm going to close my gap width and then put it back to 1% so I get those little lines around the edge. I'm going to change the color, fill. I want a solid fill. I don't want it blue. I want it medium gray. I also want to change the border from blue to solid and black. All right, that looks nice. I'm going to delete this word histogram. Got bin down here. What are these? These are roly-poly size in centimeters. I still have all these crazy digits on my graph tick marks and this word more. Remember what we have to do to get rid of the word more. We have to replace it in our little histogram table over here with the number that should be in there. What should that number be? That number should be the edge of the last bin plus the distance between any two bins. All right, so we can let Excel calculate it for us by putting a formula into that bin. I'm going to type equals. The bin before it, I want to add to that. I'm going to do an add. The difference between any two of the bins. So I'm going to go this bin again minus the last one, and that should give me the right number. All right, I'm going to highlight all of the cells in this table, and I'm going to use the change digits, change decimal. Oops, that was too many. How many do I want? I want it to match the data, so I'm going to use 1 decimal place. All right. Now we're going to describe our histogram using our Monks, M-O-N-K-S. And even if you come up with a conclusion that these data don't look super normally distributed, which you might, remember to also check the sample size, because for our t-test, our 2 independent samples t-test, if we have more than 5 observations in each of the groups, even if the data are not very normally distributed, our t-test is going to work well. All right. So even if the data are not normally distributed, if our sample size is large enough, we can go ahead with the test. So double check your notes from lecture on that. All right, so we've made a nice histogram here. I'm going to show you how to do a 2 independent samples t-test for the first set of data, and then you'll be able to do it for the second set of data as well, because it's exactly the same. It's very straightforward. All right, so we're going to go back to our data analysis tool pack. Data analysis, and then we need to look, these are in alphabetical order, so you want to scroll to the bottom, and you're going to find t-test paired to sample for means, and you're going to find t-test to sample assuming equal variances, and t-test, two-sample assuming unequal variances. Another assumption of the two independent samples t-test is we have these two different groups. And assumption is that the variances are equal. Now, we don't actually need to check that assumption because Excel is going to do it for us. So we're always going to pick for our two independent samples t-test, which is the one that Excel calls two sample. Right, we're always going to pick this unequal variances choice because what it does is it checks to see if the variances are equal, and if they aren't, then it does an adjustment for it. If the variances are equal, it does a little statistical test, right? So if the variances are equal, then it doesn't do that little adjustment, but you'll get the same, like you'll get the right answer whether your variances are equal or unequal if you choose this unequal variances option, okay? Short answer, if you want to do a two independent samples t-test in Excel, you want to pick this one, t-test, two sample, assuming unequal variances. When I click OK, it gives me a dialog box. All right, so it's going to call one of my samples variable 1 and the other one of my samples variable 2. So for one of my groups, however they're identified, I need to highlight all of the data. So all of the roly-poly links that are indicated as coming from site 30, I'm going to highlight those. Those are going to be my variable 1 range, or all the cells that contain those data. Variable 2 range, I'm going to do all the cells that contain a size of my building 42W sample. My hypothesized mean difference is our null hypothesis. We hypothesize there is 0 difference. All right, labels, usually I'm going to leave that blank. If I had a title at the top of the column of the data, and I highlighted that text, I would put it in here. There's a place for you to put in alpha, but it doesn't matter what you put in here, you'll get the same result. So we're just going to leave it as 0.05. That's going to give you the critical values for this test, right? But we want to write down the p-value for our results. So we're just going to kind of ignore that. Now, like always, we need an output range, a place where we're going to put all of the results when they come spewing out from Excel. I'm going to scroll back to the top and I'm going to put my results here. Okay, all right, so I've got my results. T-test, two sample, assuming unequal variances. All right, now this is going to give me the means, and I can look at them and I can say, oh, well, the mean is 0.778 for variable 1, which is building 30. And for, I can type those in here if I want to be nice and clear what's what. Variance of 0.02 and 0.1. I don't know whether those are equal or unequal. Sample sizes, my degrees of freedom, my t statistic. All right, it calculated little t for us as minus 3.26. Thank you, Excel. And then what we're going to get in the bottom here, this is a little cut off. And so if we want to see what is written in here, if you go to the top and you see that little two-way arrow, if you double click, it will make the box in that column as wide as it needs to be to show the widest box, right, which turns out to be this one at the top. I'm going to drag it over so it's a little skinnier. It's easier to see. Okay, so what do I have here in the table? My probability capital T less than or equal to little t one tail. That's my p-value for a one-tail hypothesis test. My t critical for a one-tail hypothesis test. Remember, those are those t stars. And you'll find that in the t table. Again, for a one-tail test. And then I have my p-value for a two-tail test. It should be 2 times the value of a one-tail test. and the critical value. So what we want to write down as our result is this, the degrees of freedom, t-statistic, and the p-value. So in this case, we're doing a two-tailed test, and we're going to write that down, 0.0016. All right, so there is our t-test. All right, so you're going to do the exact same thing. You don't have to make another histogram, but you're going to do a 2 independent samples t-test, assuming unequal variances, to also test the hypothesis that if there's a difference between size based on sex in roly-polies. All right, so same thing over here, and you want to again find your t statistic and your p value from the table that Excel puts out. All right. For question number 2, I need to explain a little bit about the situation that these data are based on. So when you go to, if you go to a residential four-year college, and especially maybe 20 years ago, like when I went to college, well, more than that, in the bad old days, when you would move into your dorm on your college campus and you would start eating in the dining hall for the college, it was not necessarily the healthiest food. It was sort of trying to please everyone. A lot of meat and potatoes, maybe not so many vegetables, not so many healthy, fresh options as we have today. And there was a tradition that most freshmen, when they went away to college, that they gained weight. And in fact, it was called the freshman 15, as many as 15 pounds that somebody might gain in their first semester at college. And isn't just the food, it's a difference in lifestyle, maybe not being as active, also being under a lot of stress. All those things play into this phenomenon. All right, so these data are on students who went to start their freshman year at a residential college. There's 38 individuals here. And what we have is we have their initial weight in pounds when they started the semester, and then their weight after 12 weeks of the semester. So this is a situation where we have a paired t-test. We have the same individual and they were measured 2 times. And we want to know if they actually gained any weight. So our null hypothesis is going to be that they didn't gain any weight, that their weight changed 0 amount. Right, so when we are doing our paired t-test, remember that when we're doing the calculations by hand, we're going to find out how much of a difference there is between these 2 different measurements, and we would find the mean of the differences, and we would also find the standard deviation of the differences. Now, we don't need to do that in order to have Excel calculate the paired t-test for us, but I'm going to have you do it for this exercise because we want to be able to summarize what happened in our study, and we also need to make a histogram that is going to test the assumption that the data are normally distributed. For this test, the assumption is that the difference between the measurements is normally distributed. So in order to check that assumption, we're going to, in the top row, we're going to say equals, and we're just going to do the term or the 12-week weight minus the initial weight. If they gained weight, that would be positive. All right, this individual lost weight. They lost 3 pounds. The stress overpowered the eating. All right, I'm going to copy and paste that formula all the way down. All right, that is going to give me my column of values. One person here stayed exactly the same weight. Right, now I'm going to make a histogram of this column of values, okay? And since we just practiced making a histogram, I'm going to leave that up to you, but this is what we want to make the histogram of. Right, and we can also if you're curious, if we're just curious what the average difference was. Oh, that isn't going to help me. What am I doing? Equals average. I can find out what the mean is, the difference, and say, aha, there was 2.1 pounds difference, and it's a positive number, so it was a weight gain. All right, so that is not close to 15. So we're going to still test our hypothesis that there was no weight gain, or that there was weight gain. And we're going to use the data analysis tool pack. Now, careful, because we want to do t-test paired. Now, it calls it a 2 sample, but, and you can argue about whether the 2 different times that we measured the same individual counts as 2 different samples. I personally don't think of it that way, but we're going to clue in on this word paired. All right, so our paired t-test is going to be the one we want to do. Now notice it also has boxes, dialog boxes, where we're going to put in variable 1 and variable 2. Right, so we're going to put in for variable 1, we're going to put in all of 1 of the measurements that were made on each individual. Right, and then we need to click our mouse in variable 2, and we're going to put in all the, so I need to do it the same way. Start at highlighting at the top and go down to the bottom. Again, our hypothesized mean difference is going to be 0. That's our null hypothesis. We're going to skip the labels. We're going to let it stay at alpha equals 0.05. We have to select an output range. Click the mouse in that cell. And then I'm going to give it a spot to put my results. Right, so notice that putting this data in this way, variable 1, variable 2, once you look at the dialog box, it isn't necessarily obvious that you have selected the paired version or the 2 independent samples version. And so you, the thinking scientist, you need to make sure that you have picked the correct type of test, right? Sometimes students get confused because when you go to the paired t-test dialog box, you think that you need to put in these differences, because that's how we do this test when we're doing it by hand, right? That's not how Excel is going to do it, right? So we did this calculation so that we could make a histogram of the differences, but you're not going to highlight the differences. That's our by hand method. Excel gets all of the first measurements and all the second ones, right? So it's going to it needs to do some internal calculations where it needs all of the data for. All right, I'm going to click OK. And once again, I'm going to get this table with lots of info in it. I need to be able to interpret that information. So we get the mean, 136.4 versus 138.5. That's about 2 pounds like we saw when we found the mean already. 38 observations. Sometimes if you are not sure that you did a test right, you can double check the mean that you got and the mean that's in the test to see if you didn't highlight all the cells, or if you something like that. So looking at all of this information is useful. Our degrees of freedom is 37. Remember, degrees of freedom is usually little n minus 1, so that looks right. Our little t value, our test statistic, is -5.10. And our p-value for a one-tailed test. Now, in this question, it said that we wanted to find out if students gained weight, right? We weren't expecting them to lose weight. So we're actually doing a one-tailed test in this case, right? So we want to select the appropriate p-value out of the two that it gives, whether we're doing a one-tail or a two-tail, right? So notice this number, 5.18 e minus 0.6. What does that mean? That's scientific notation, how Excel does it. So it's 5.18 times 10 to the minus sixth, right? So if you're writing, you don't have to write it. You can write it that way, or you can write it out. 0.00000, sorry, 0.000000518. All right, so we're going to compare that to our alpha, decide if we're going to reject our null hypothesis. All right, so doing t-tests in Excel is pretty easy. The only tricky part is just remembering, double checking and making sure that you've opened the correct test that you found and that you've highlighted the data the correct way. So this should get you off to a good start on finishing your worksheet.